There's a side of architecture that most won't really talk about. It's a side that is nuanced, it's difficult, complex, ambiguous at times, it's constantly changing, it's even open to interpretation. We're talking about building codes. You see, if you start with Simon Sinek's Start With Why, where the premise is, if you have a strong enough why for the thing that you're trying to do, which you're inherently disinclined to, then you'll have a greater reason for doing it or accomplishing that goal. And it's the same with building codes. This video is going to provide a high-level overview of what's contained in the code. And even though we're going to be using the California Building Code, whether your state uses the IBC or some other code, then it's still going to be pertinent because everything is based off of the IBC. Let's begin with Title 24. The entire set of building codes in California can be referred to as Title 24. We can call the entire set also by the California Building Standards Code, or the CBSC. So we can say Title 24 or California Building Standards Code to refer to the entire set of building codes here in California. The CBSC is the 24th title out of a total of 28 titles in the California Code of Regulations. California alone contains some over 200 regulatory agencies with all of their standards embedded in the code. Title 24, however, is maintained, and this is a key note to know, by the California Building Standards Commission. So it is adopted by the California Building Standards Commission. They take the IBC and they amend it and adopt it specifically for California. Title 24 is made up of 12 parts. Don't get confused by the California Building Code and the California Building Standards Code. One term describes the actual Part 2 of Title 24, and the other describes the entirety of the code of Title 24. The California Building Code can be divided into two volumes. Volume 1 has chapters 1 through 15, and Volume 2 has the remainder of the chapters. The sequence of the chapters matter, and they are purposefully organized to guide architects, engineers, and building professionals through the process of applying the code to a specific building or project. Each chapter can be understood as one step that leads to the next. If you're new to the AEC industry and you want to know what the chapters really mean and which ones do you really need to focus on, there's no singular answer. The entire code works together. Every part of it is important. It's a link in a larger chain. Building professionals, however, do find themselves referencing some chapters more than others. Let's do a quick review of what we would use some of these chapters for in the California Building Code, and you can follow along in your own state's code or the IBC. CBC Chapter 2, one of the most important chapters. It's the foundation for the entire code. It provides important definitions for key terms that are used in the code. Any good building professional will say that they use this chapter a lot throughout their career. If you understand how the commission defines keywords used in the industry rather than someone's definition, you will be much more successful in your code analysis. Next, CBC Chapter 3. It is used to establish the use and occupancy of a building. It's like saying, hey, what is your building going to be used for? It describes what happens in the building. Who are the users? What is the building used for? How tall and big can a building be? This all depends on the type of construction and the occupancy and use. A building that is classified as an assembly occupancy for large events, let's say you're designing a stadium, is going to have much different requirements for life safety than a retail one-story store with fewer occupants. You're just going to treat each building much differently in terms of life safety. And that's the bottom line. We're talking about life safety. That is the intent behind every regulation as you're reading the code. Chapter 4 describes special uses and occupancies. These are buildings such as open mall buildings, could be hospitals, could be buildings with hazardous materials, jails, and prisons, to name a few. These all have much different requirements than designing a typical building. If you found this video useful, please give it a thumbs up and consider giving a super thanks of any amount. I'd really appreciate it. It helps the channel greatly. Thanks again, and let's continue. Chapter 5 establishes the limits to which a building can be built. The building height, number of stories, building area are all specified in this chapter. This chapter is used together with occupancies in Chapter 3 and the type of construction in Chapter 6. It also discusses how do you deal with mezzanines, accessory occupancies, and mixed occupancies. CBC Chapter 6 defines 5 types of construction. It looks at the materials used in the building, whether they're combustible or non-combustible, and the extent to which buildings such as the frame, the roof, the wall, the floor can resist fire, because we're going to assign fire resistance ratings to every element of a building. A fire resistance of typically 1 to 3 hours is specified depending on the component and the type of construction. More fire resistant types of construction allow for taller and bigger buildings. CBC Chapter 7 describes detailed requirements for fire resistance rated construction, including structural members, walls, partitions, and horizontal assemblies. That's okay if these words don't have a specific meaning to you yet. They will once we start looking at them a little more. Chapter 9 is more about, remember that Chapter 9 is about active fire resistant systems. But think of Chapter 7 as being more focused on passive fire resistance systems. Chapter 7 details how elements are constructed, how openings in walls and partitions are protected, and how penetrations of such elements are protected. CBC Chapter 8 contains performance requirements for controlling fire growth and smoke propagation within buildings by restricting interior finish and decorative materials. CBC Chapter 9 prescribes minimum requirements for active fire protection equipment systems to perform the functions of detecting a fire, alerting the occupants or fire department of a fire emergency, providing for a mass notification, gas detection, controlling smoke, and extinguishing a fire. It is based on the occupancy, height, and area of the building, since these are the factors that most affect firefighting capabilities and the relative hazards of a specific building. This chapter is similar to Chapter 9 of the California Fire Code. CBC Chapter 10 provides the criteria for designing the means of egress for protection of people in buildings by allowing timely relocation or evacuation of building occupants. There are both prescriptive and performance language utilized in this chapter for a basic approach in determining a safe exiting system for all occupancies. It addresses all portions of the egress system, the exit access, exit, and exit discharge. If you're new to building codes or this whole world of building codes, or you're studying for an exam, or you're trying to apply it to a project, the best advice I can give you is to start applying these concepts on a project. Start with a small scale project with 1 or 2 spaces and see how you can start to apply some of these chapters. So what we've just reviewed is the most frequently referenced chapters of the code. And I would say if you're new to this area, or if you already know some of these codes but need to dive in a little deeper, I would just go to the International Code Council website, or you can use UpCodes and start to scroll through different parts of the code. You don't have to read the code, but just start to get familiar with it. Scroll through Chapter 2, scroll through Chapter 3, and just look at what is in it. And just start to get familiar with it, right? You're testing the water if you're new to this whole world of building codes. And if you're not new to it and you're using this as a refresher to study for an exam, I would also do the same thing. It's always important to start with the basics If you have a strong foundation with the basics of what the codes are, how these chapters are organized, then you're going to have a better chance of knowing how to answer a question